collecting all our data, everything was being pulled into what was called CAMP, and that was Canadian Athlete Monitoring Program. And it was a Smartabase back engine that was made available by OTP to basically all the sports out there. And I'm sure Steve back there still has nightmares about CAMP. But it was a great concept. It was just not, it ended up being too popular. And I think it wasn't something that Steve would ever have been able to do on his own with the demand that it actually ended up creating. But it was a database project that was supposed to get all the medical, all the sports science data for all of the Canadian NSOs into one place. So that if somebody was tested in Ottawa and then tested in Calgary, all the data would go into the same place. And it was all shared data across the network that way. So that's where all these numbers are going to come from. So the whole process here starts with our monitoring and our recovery monitoring program. And what we did is we had a modified Hooper-McKinnon questionnaire. And this was collected daily. The data we're going to show you is this is over a 2-year period. First thing in the morning, within 20 minutes of waking up and getting out of bed. It was all done online. The reason we went with a morning collection is we knew that the first thing every athlete was going to do when they woke up in the morning, maybe the second thing, was go to the bathroom and check your phone. You know, whichever order that happened in, we didn't really care, but we knew that was what was going to happen. So it was a good way to improve compliance. The other thing with this was, by them doing it first thing in the morning, our first on-water session was normally 7:30 in the morning. So I could be up by 7, log in from home, put together the report that would go off to the coach. He would get the report on his phone by 7:30 when everybody was showing up at the lake. And then he would decide, if you haven't filled out your report yet, you don't get on the water. And so we had very, very high compliance rates for all of this recovery data, which makes it very, very useful when you get that kind of information and that level of information. We did everything. So if you're familiar with this kind of modified Hooper-McKinnon questionnaire, you'll get numbers. You know, it's a 1 to 7 scale off of 7 or 8 questions. So you may get numbers, baseline numbers in the 30s. You may get some people in the 40s, et cetera, et cetera. And using some of the arbitrary cutoffs that say, you know, a 35 means you're yellow and a 42 means you're red or something like that, just never really worked for me. And so I had come across this article here. This Berglund and Safstrom article had actually been looking at canoe kayak athletes, and they were doing a different recovery questionnaire, but it was the concept of the recovery questionnaire and what they did with it that really intrigued me. So what they did with their questionnaire is they actually looked at dividing it into different relative score levels. So establishing a baseline early in the off season or over Christmas or whenever we had lower training volumes, and then breaking that into 3 zones, which we considered a recovery zone, a training zone, and an overstress zone. So all our analysis we'll see coming up is kind of based around that notion. So those were the questions that we used, you know, the standard fatigue, stress, sleep, et cetera, et cetera. Sleep we recorded in 15-minute increments. So they were asked to put it back, to type it in 15-minute increments. So we got pretty good resolution on the sleep from that as well. One of the big things when we started all of this data collection, and I think what also helped our compliance besides the coach forcing everybody to do it, was just also the notion that we promised the athletes if we were going to make you do something and collect data, if we were going to have you fill something out, whether it was training logs, whether it's recovery questionnaires, whether we're asking you to, you know, use some sort of a wearable, we would promise that we were going to give you something useful out of the data. Something was going to come out of this data. We weren't just collecting data because we could. And so we were looking at things like, whether it's changes to the training program, changes to our long-term plans, driving our decision making. Something has to come out of the data in order for us to start implementing it in our program. We had looked at this, the survey as a means of monitoring recovery. And it's the theory around all of these surveys is that athletes who are recovering better are going to get better training adaptations. Unfortunately, what happens in a lot of cases, that's not actually tested. We're making the assumption that you're recovering better, you're going to get better adaptations, and that your recovery is somehow linked to your adaptations. But in many cases, this isn't actually tested. That a lot of the information that is out there on these athletes' self-monitoring questionnaires doesn't actually include here's what a physiological change that comes out of these. Athletes that recovering get this change, athletes that aren't recovering get this change. So that sort of sparked the question. Because of our promise that we would give you something useful out of this, we've asked you to spend a year, year and a half, 2 years, filling this in every single morning. We owe you at least an analysis of whether we're going to keep doing this or not. And there were other things that we had been collecting data on that we just stopped. So earlier on in the quad, 2013, we'd actually spent a whole year where we had them with heart rate monitors that they would wear for every training session they did. We had them recording what was happening in their training logs. And then we went back and we did a comparison between what the heart rate monitor said, what the training log said, and what the training program had originally been set out to say. We found that there was only about a 7% difference between actual and what was in the program. So we didn't feel there was really any need to measure that anymore. So we pulled that out. We didn't ask the athletes to do that anymore. Because again, it's part of that ethic of not wanting to make them do something just so we get data to do it if we aren't going to get something useful out of that data. So again, we saw here our overall compliance was about 88, just over 88%. Okay, so to look at whether we were actually seeing whether our recovery data was making any difference, we wanted to look at how our recovery scores were tying up with the adaptations, the aerobic training adaptations we were seeing from the lactate step test that we were doing. And so we took our data over a period of, again, a 2-year period here that was used. And some of the stuff you're going to see up here is just snapshots of different points in time. It's not the whole 2 years. So we looked at 3 key physiological points. So our benchmarks for performance were built around 2, 4, and 6 millimole points. And we had our definitions for improvements. What we saw based on the repeatability of our testing was if we were getting greater than 6 watt increases on 2 or more of the 2, 4, and 6 millimole points, we were pretty confident that an improvement had occurred. We were looking at neutral as anything that was kind of plus or minus 6 watts on 2 of the 3 points, and a decrease we defined as a decrease of 6 watts on 2 of the 3 points. And then we looked at this in relation to the percentage of time spent in each of those zones we looked at on the previous slide, that recovery zone, that training zone, and that overstress zone. This is so this is looking at 2 different time periods here. November to January, and then a January to March time period. We also looked at this over the full 2 years, so a January 14 to January 16 time period, and we looked at it through multiple other time periods in there. And what I really liked about this, one of the messages that you'll see comes through this is the data visualizations become really important because they sometimes will tell you things that the numbers aren't necessarily telling you. And so when we started looking at this, originally we'd done all the statistics, running correlations between this and the other thing, and weren't really seeing anything happening. So when we went to this kind of a stoplight system here, basically, with a red meaning it decreased, a green is an increase, a yellow was neutral, And this is basically what you see in most testing sessions you'll get. Some people get better, some people stay the same, some people stay the worst, or get worse. The question always becomes, why does this happen? And that's what we were trying to figure out with all of this. And what we noticed as we started looking across all of these different time periods and looking at these lactate step test results across varying lengths of time, varying times of the year, that the thing that became really consistent was, if you look at these numbers out here, so the percentages of time above that 1.5 times their baseline or 150% of your baseline. This is what we noticed was that if you look at all the people in red or yellow, they're all higher scores in there. All the people that were improving were fairly low scores in there. And when this all, so typically what we would see, this type of a breakdown with people improving, regressing, and staying neutral. So in the end, what this all came down to for us was 96% of the time, if somebody decreased their performance in the step test, it's because they had more than 10% of their Hooper-McKinnon days above that 1.5 times their baseline. 18 of the 20 tests where there was people that were neutral had more than 10% of their Hooper-McKinnon scores above baseline. 81% of the time, having less than 10% of your Hooper-McKinnon scores above that baseline resulted in an improvement. And every case where somebody went from one time period to another, where they switched from having more than 10% of their days to less than 10% of their days above that 1.5 times baseline threshold, they would switch from either getting worse or staying neutral to actually starting to see improvements again, and it went the other way as well. So what this all told us in the end was the data, for us it was pretty clear that it showed that there's a stress level beyond which the adaptations weren't occurring anymore, and that we were actually capable of measuring where this stress level was using this modified Hooper-McKinnon and basing it on relative scores from an individually determined baseline. So now we've got these things that we decided to call red days. And we called them red days because in the report that went off to the coach, they were all shaded in red so that the coach didn't have to read through everybody's individual things. He just had to look for the red days. Okay? So what was causing red days? Well, we looked at training volume and intensity distribution, and it was very similar to what we've used in past years with past groups. So, you know, wasn't a lot of variation in there. We looked at nutrition. Nutrition was similar or better than we had seen in past years and with past groups, where we had had better or higher rates of improvement from test to test than we were seeing with this particular group of athletes. So we decided to take a look at sleep and sleep patterns. And again, if you remember from our list, one of the things we did collect was we were collecting sleep hours every day of the week. So even on Sunday, when it wasn't a training day, they were still expected to fill in the Hooper-McKinnon and include their sleep hours with that. So just going back and looking at some data, you know, 8 to 9 hours per night was average sleep in 1959, and that's down to 6.5 to 7.5 hours where things are sitting currently. Low levels of nighttime sleep lead to all these potential problems: decreased cognitive performance, decreased mood, suppressed immune function, increased muscle and joint soreness. There's a lot of research out there now suggesting that sleep plays a very significant role in skill learning as well, and that the timing of sleep in relation to skill sessions can enhance skilled performances or the rate at which skills are actually learned. So at the LTC, stands for London Training Center, the heavyweight women were averaging 7.5 hours per night. The lightweight women were averaging 8.3 hours per night, and the light men were averaging 8.4 hours per night. So if we're looking at recommendations of 8 to 9 hours per night, you look at this and say, you know, there's a little bit of a problem here, but 7.7, that's pretty close. If that's an average, that means you've got some that are above that, some that are below that. You know, so is it really a problem? We decided to do morning-eveningness questionnaire, because one of the things that happens with rowing is there's this tendency for everything to be done very early in the morning. You know, as I said, our typical sessions would start at 7:30, which means athletes are arriving at the lake sometime between 7 and 7:30. Depending on where they live, they're getting up anywhere between 5 and 6 a.m. to get out there and do this. And our last training sessions of the day would typically, depending on where it was in the week, could be finishing as late as 6 o'clock. So we're getting some, you know, pretty spread out days potentially with this. And very much the reason for the early mornings in rowing, because, you know, a lot of the time you just sit back and say, well, why don't you start later? Better water will always be earlier in the morning. As everything starts to warm up, as the day starts to warm up, you tend to get more winds and you get rougher water as a result of that. And so for good quality technical rowing, early morning sessions will tend to be better. Okay, so here's the morning eveningness questionnaire, which basically, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, kind of tells you, are you a morning person, are you an evening person? It gives some ideas in here too about, you know, where their actual wake-up times are at, and then the algorithms in this questionnaire, you know, calculate sort of a preferred wake-up time as well. So there's definitely, we saw this, and there's definitely a clue in here that suggests we basically have one person that is waking up in their preferred wake-up time. Yeah. As we looked at this, we saw that most of our people were intermediate types. We only had 3 morning types. Everybody else was an intermediate type. We really didn't have any night owls. And I think some of that becomes a natural selection process in a sport like rowing. If you've got to spend your whole university career in the sport and your whole national team career in the sport waking up very early in the morning in order to do the sport, and you're an evening person, you're probably looking for a different sport. We also did the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, and basically this is something that they use as kind of an initial look to see if there is some sort of a clinical sleep disorder going on. Scores greater than 5 suggest a sleep problem. So you take a look over here. I think we got some sleep problems. Now, there was one person on the team who kind of skewed some of these results, and particularly those lactate results we talked about earlier, because she actually did have a clinical sleep disorder that she was being treated for. And she was one of the ones that would go contrary to what the pattern was around red days and whether she made performance improvements or not. So we took the next step of looking at this, and what kind of spurred this is I'm looking at this big sheet of numbers. So we pulled all the numbers out of camp, put them all into an Excel sheet, and I'm just kind of sitting there staring at this sheet of numbers. And sometimes in doing a data analysis, what isn't there is actually as or more important than the numbers that are there. And so as I'm sitting there staring at this sheet of numbers, the one thing that I didn't see very often was numbers 8 or higher. And so that made me start to wonder, okay, our percentages, you know, we're not that far off as far as average number of sleep hours. But what does this look like if we actually start trying to break this out and look at how is this distributed? What percentage of their nights, or what number of nights, does somebody actually get 8 hours of sleep or more? So I went back to our old data from 2012. And so the 2012 data was This was pre-camp, pre-database. This was all Excel collected stuff. Wasn't being collected every day because that meant getting the handwritten things and typing them in, and it was just a pain in the butt, so we didn't do it very often. We tended to do it at training camps and before competitions and things like that. So when I started looking at our 2012 group, which was a medal-winning group in London, so we look at our sleep distribution here. 73% of the nights were 8 hours or more. Our 2016 group, 50% of the nights were 8 hours or more. So very different. Again, when we pulled up the two graphs, this is when something kind of hit. It was like, oh yeah, there is definitely something going on here. And it's not just looking at the averages. Because again, a 7.78 versus an 8.1, it's not a big difference. But when we started looking at the shape of these distributions, and we see that this distribution is very much skewed to being under 8 hours a night, whereas this distribution is skewed to being more than 8 hours a night, we felt that this was something we needed to start taking a closer look at. So we went and now started to say, okay, we think there's a sleep problem. We know red days cause a problem. Is sleep actually related to the red days? Is sleep impacting recovery? Is sleep impacting our adaptations? So we took the year and we broke the year out into different time periods based on where we were training. So in the training center, national championships in there. So they went away and traveled, did a national championships in BC, came back. Another training period at home. Christmas, our first camp down in Florida, the period back. Our next two camps in Florida, World Cups, and then World Cup out there. And this is the percentage of nights of 8 hours sleep or more, and the percentage of days where their Hooper-McKinnon was above that 1.5 times their baseline. So again, remember we said that anything over 10% we were seeing was not leading to adaptations. When we ran a correlation between these two things, we actually found out that we were looking at a negative 0.885 correlation between our 8 hours or greater of sleep per night and the percentage of days that were actually in the red. So the lower our number of 8 hours per night of sleep, the higher our number of red days were. So again, this kind of reinforced our need to go back and, yeah, there's a problem. This is a problem that is ultimately probably affecting our performance. The next piece was we went back and we looked at a Christmas distribution. Because the unique thing about Christmas is they all go away, and that leaves them all completely in charge of their own training. We send them a program and say, you need to do this, 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 and this. We're not telling you when you have to do it. You set your own wake-up time, you set your own bedtime, you set your own schedule as to when you do your training sessions. This looks like a pretty normal distribution to me. We actually saw here 63% 8 hours sleep or more, and only 6.8% of the days were red days. And a number of these red days here, and what dragged this down a bit was the day or two of jet lag on either end for people that would be flying back out west. So, what this really started telling us was we needed to take a look at what we were doing within the program itself. Because if you go away and you're giving complete control over when you're doing everything, and we get this type of a sleep distribution, and we get this few red days, then all of the other stuff that is messing this up is us screwing it up. So here's just a quick list of all the different factors that we needed to think about in all of this. You know, the effect high body temperatures delay sleep onset. Soreness or uncomfortable beds, again, will affect sleep quality, sleep hours. Screen time, technology, naps, Nutrition, we had athletes, talking about waking up hungry. And this was particularly true in some of the lightweights as they were coming down to weight. Psychological stress, and then training start times. So one of the first things we looked at, because if we go back, if you remember back to a couple of slides earlier when we looked at the percentage of red days versus the sleep, our two lowest sleep periods, our two worst sleep periods, and our two highest periods of red days were both at the camps we did down in Florida. So these were camps we were doing at the University of Central Florida, and we were staying in a particular hotel. We got a lot of complaints about beds and stuff out of that hotel. What did we do the next year? We switched hotels. So we made the conscious decision that if this hotel is potentially the problem, we needed to look at a solution, and the solution was we need to find a different hotel. So we had identified this early enough that we hadn't committed to that same hotel for the next year. When we came back and we looked at this, you can see average sleep went up a little bit. Red days dropped down significantly. The hotel still wasn't great, but it was definitely better quality sleep, better quality beds coming out of that hotel. We saw similar things in Europe as well, where some of the hotels we stayed at in Europe, the athletes would bring mattress toppers with them because the beds were just that uncomfortable at even some of the better hotels we stayed at in Switzerland and stuff. Okay, so hotel change brought us a pretty good drop in our total number of red days. We also started breaking things out by day of the week to see if there were any trends based on the day of the week that we were looking at in here. One of the things that was really interesting is Wednesday. So what they reported Wednesday morning was their worst night of the week. What was happening was Tuesday evening, so our final training session, which would have been third session of the day on Tuesday, typically started around 4:30 or so. And it was really a very high, it was an indoor session done on the ergs. So you get 26 people on these rowing ergometers. They can generate an awful lot of heat. It was a low rate, kind of high force production, long row. It was a 3 by 20 minute or 4 by 20 minute piece at a prescribed stroke rate and a prescribed wattage. We actually saw, we could see the effects of the metabolic load just looking at heart rate and the way heart rate would drift from one piece to the next, even though we weren't seeing any changes in wattage. We might see a difference of 30 beats per minute on heart rate for the exact same wattage. So Tuesday night, we were building up huge amounts of heat. It was affecting their sleep because what they're reporting from, or what we're seeing Wednesday morning, was their Tuesday night sleep. So with that, problems of sleep onset corresponding with decreases in core temperature, and us driving core temperature up so late in the process, so late in the day, it was causing a lot of people not to be able to get to sleep before 11, 12, 1 in the morning, potentially. So what we did about it is we moved that session. There was nothing that said we had to have that session as final session of the day. It just means juggling some schedules and some timing of use of the space a little bit. But we moved that session into a Tuesday morning session. And then the final session on Tuesday afternoon was a much lighter session. It was more prehab, rehab exercise type session as opposed to a very high metabolic session. All of a sudden, we're now seeing our Wednesdays jumping up to from 44 to 55% of their nights with 8 hours or more. Again, just by making a slight tweak, a slight adjustment to the program. Start time. We had noticed a pattern. I had noticed a pattern when we were over in Europe for racing. And start time with this group of athletes was really tightly tied to their number of sleep hours. That this was not a group of athletes that would adjust when they went to bed based on when they had to get up. This was a bunch of athletes that went to bed at the same time and just didn't sleep as much if they had to get up earlier. So they weren't making that adjustment. And it wasn't a behavioral thing we were going to change. You know, we can all sit here and say, well, just tell them to go to bed earlier. Like, they're not going to do it. They proved they're not going to do it. You know, because this is racing time. If they're not going to do it at racing time, they're sure as heck not going to do it through their training year. So we saw very tightly tied. You know, you can see every time they did a pre-row earlier, we would drop off. When they could sleep in, sleep hours would rise. And it just went, you know, followed this religiously. And we've seen this in other sports. If you look at some of the literature, particularly around swimming and stuff like that, you know, another sport that tends to have very early start sessions, it's pretty clear that early morning start times have a negative impact on total sleep hours. And particularly when you are dealing with, you know, if you get into some younger athletes as well, it becomes even more of an issue. So what did we do? We adjusted training back 30 minutes for all of our indoor and most of our outdoor sessions the next year. Okay? About 78% of our total training sessions were adjusted back over the course of the year. Moved 7:30 a.m. meet times to 8 a.m. meet times. There were some times where, just depending on what the weather forecast said, we would still have to meet early just to get good water. This is what we started seeing then. Again, if we look at 2015 versus 2016, we're getting small. It's being reflected, the average sleep hours is reflecting that change in start times. Now, your question about the Saturday, Sundays. Saturdays and Sundays were always 2 training sessions a day instead of 3. And so we would get better sleep scores off of that because Saturdays and Sundays traditionally started with 9 a.m. rows as opposed to 7 or 7:30 a.m. rows.
So later start time plus lower training volume.
Yeah, we were able to start later because of there only being 2 sessions a day. Okay? So pushing back that start time, again, trivial to small improvements right across the board as a result of doing that. So when we look at the 2 years, you can see this was the 2015 distribution curve. This is the 2016. This still isn't, you know, it's not ideal. It is still skewed a little bit to being under 8 hours a day, but it's a whole lot better than it was the year before. And that was all just through making some minor tweaks and minor adjustments in the program that really were fairly simple to implement. It didn't require the athletes to have to make a whole bunch of behavioral changes because behavioral changes are really tough to make, particularly when you're talking about behaviors around things like sleep. You know, people will get into their patterns that kind of fit their lives, and they're trying to fit a life around their training. You know, with 3 training sessions a day, as I said, most of these athletes, their days typically had been running 7:30 in the morning till 6 o'clock at night by the time they had finished all of their, you know, self-care and everything else. So their days became very broken up. That their sleep time and everything and the routines they would build around their sleep time were there to put some sense of normalcy for them into their lives. And we felt it was important to try to help them maintain that sense of normalcy so that if we could make adjustments to what went on in the program to help them sleep better, we were more likely to have success doing that than we would asking them to change their nap times, asking them to change their bedtimes, etc. So overall, if we look on the sleep side of this, change in sleep patterns resulted in about a 10.4% decrease in the number of red days. Our aerobic and strength and power scores improved more consistently compared to the prior year, with more than 50% of the athletes improving across all test periods, whereas normally we had been looking at about a 35% of athletes seeing improvements from test period to test period. Now we were seeing 50% of the athletes improving from test period to test period, and we were seeing fewer people that were actually decreasing. So of our 4 test periods, 3 of the 4 we had less than 2 athletes showing decreases in their performance from test period to test period. We still had a number of neutrals in there. We hadn't eliminated all the neutrals, so we weren't getting everybody improving, but it was definitely ahead of where we had been before. We had also started looking at, based on all of this stuff here, we had started looking at doing a sleep extension study that was funded through the I4G Innovations for Gold projects from Own the Podium. And again, just because of the timing of that being sort of in our final 6 weeks towards Rio, we didn't get as much out of that as we'd hoped we would, but it would have been something if I'd kind of continued on with rowing after Rio that we were going to be looking at. On the data side, try to collect actionable data. Does the data support what you're seeing in real life? Visualizations in all of this were key. Plotting out all kinds of different graphs, different charts, different color schemes, playing around with how you see the data is very often where you are going to see the things that become interesting, much more so than just tables of numbers and then running statistics on those tables of numbers. And then the only other point to add into this, very often the numbers that aren't there are more important than the numbers that are there. What aren't you seeing that you would expect to see or want to see becomes a kind of a shift in your thinking in the way you look at your data. All right, that's it then.
Thank you.